Thank you, Mr. President. I rise this morning to outline some ideas about our national security as we approach the end of the year. Many Americans are heading into the holiday season with some very reasonable fears about the threats facing our nation. In 2017, we saw an emboldened North Korean regime testing missiles and nuclear weapons. Terrorist groups continue to execute attacks across the globe. Violent state and non-state actors continue to destabilize Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine, Yemen, Nigeria, and others. We saw Russia continue meddling in elections, just as they did in ours last year. This was a year of great volatility and uncertainty. However, we also saw the United States military leading an international coalition that is loosening the stranglehold ISIS had on parts of Iraq and Syria. We saw the recovery of American hostages, including constituents of mine, held captive for years by terrorists. In Europe, U.S. and NATO forces partnered to counter Russian aggression and dispel propaganda. U.S. development assistance, or I should say assistance projects, helped hundreds of millions of people across the world, including 11 million farmers and 27.5 million children under the Feed the Future program. Even when it seemed like there were many reasons to be afraid, the U.S. military, diplomats, and development professionals were responsible for a lot of good progress this year. On Monday of this week, President Trump laid out his administration's national security strategy. I want to commend the work of the national security professionals who crafted the document, which warrants a thorough review. It's a substantial body of work, but it paints a very dark picture of the world and our role in it. A little more than 2 years ago, I stood here on this floor and invoked Senator Vandenberg, the senator from Michigan, back at the World War II era. Invoked his words for, quote, maximum united effort, unquote, and Senator Vandenberg's admonition that politics should stop at the water's edge. When I spoke these words, this was at a time when it seemed that the only response from my Republican colleagues had at that time to the Obama administration's foreign policy moves was, to use my words, categorical condemnation. So I won't categorically condemn the administration's new strategy, but I will pose a challenge, and here it is. Reject the false choice between investing at home and engaging abroad. Utilize our diplomatic and development toolkit as much, if not more than, you exercise our defense capabilities. Lead by example. The world will indeed become a dark place if we hide America's light under a bushel basket, to use words from Scripture. In the face of our adversaries' aggression, we can choose between competition and cooperation. The new strategy outlined by the administration references competition nearly 3 times more than cooperation. I would suggest to the administration the words of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who said, quote, competition has been shown to be useful up to a certain point and no further, but cooperation, which is the thing we must strive for today, begins where competition leaves off, unquote. When I was speaking a few moments ago about national security, I had made a suggestion to the administration now that there's a national security strategy that's been outlined that that the administration reject the false choice between investing at home and engaging abroad, and making sure that they would utilize our diplomatic and development toolkits as much, if not more than, the exercise of our defense capabilities. We have major challenges, and that's why I think it's important to outline this morning some of those challenges and some of our responses as we head into the new year. Just for discussion purposes, I wanted to paint the picture of a nation that it doesn't describe one nation, but I think we can imagine a country that fits this description, or at least a number of countries that might. If you just imagine a sovereign state, a member of the United Nations, a nation whose leaders are singularly focused on staying in power and who will do anything to remain in power, including undermining their colleagues and erstwhile friends. In this country I'm describing, those who speak truth to power are dismissed, ridiculed, or at worst treated as criminals. This particular country, or profile of a country, looks inward, putting its domestic troubles first as its reputation in the world declines. Out of fear of its near-peer competitors, the country retreats from diplomatic engagement and doubles down on military capabilities. Does this sound familiar? It might to some. It may describe a number of countries in whole or in part. Of course, there are a number of countries that fit this description. Certainly the dictatorial regimes that rule North Korea, Syria, and Iran prioritize self-preservation over the welfare of their citizens. In Russia and China, journalists and opposition leaders are regularly silenced, jailed, or worse. Here in the U.S., we're going through an especially turbulent chapter in the American story. As we celebrate the holidays, we might be dreading the inevitable political debates with family members or friends whose views differ from ours. However, in that fictitious, oppressive country that I described earlier, you can't have these debates. Or you can try, but you won't last too long because the authorities will come knocking. That's what's great about our country. The United States is the land of the free and the home of the brave. And I'm reminded of that every time I meet with service members and veterans who are willing to put their lives on the line every day to defend our inalienable rights to criticize and to disagree with our leaders. So what about this new strategy that the administration just outlined this week? This new strategy states in pertinent part, quote, "America possesses unmatched political, economic, military, and technological advantages," unquote. That's what the strategy says. And that's certainly true. But I think we should add a few other advantages, even attributes that are part of the American story, part of the American advantage. Certainly, our history of generosity sets us apart from the world. A tradition of pluralism as well. The freedom to debate and dissent without fear. The respect for the rule of law. And finally, a culture of innovation, unmatched anywhere in the world. As I've said before, Americans don't wait for the future, we invent the future. Through the execution of its strategy, the administration has an opportunity to invent the future of our nation as well as its role in the world. A future where the American economy is firing on all cylinders, where investments here at home lift everyone up, where our researchers and manufacturers lead the world in production of cutting-edge technologies. For the last 11 months, this administration has sent the world mixed signals about what, quote, America first, unquote, really means. From pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement, to threatening to walk away from NATO, to hollowing out the State Department. I believe the strategy implementation presents an opportunity to reverse that course. We cannot turn away from the world and try to go it alone. We should ask our allies, certainly, to pull their weight and pay their fair share. Whether it's NATO or the counter-ISIS coalition, the U.S. can always press our partners to do more, but not by threatening that we'll abandon these alliances or by creating any uncertainty about these alliances. Simply put, we need partners to tackle some of the greatest threats facing our nation in the world. Let's go through a couple of them. North Korea, first on the list. The North Korean regime is unpredictable and armed with nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, and the means to deliver them. Just across the demilitarized zone are tens of thousands of U.S. forces and our South Korean allies. Just across the water are more U.S. military personnel and our Japanese allies. This regime is a significant threat, the North Korean regime, a threat exacerbated by reckless ridicule, bombastic statements, and ill-considered tweets. One miscalculation can be disastrous. The administration should accelerate serious, sober diplomacy in lockstep with our allies. And let's maybe, for the new year, agree on a new rule. All of us, both branches of government. Leave the tweets for domestic policy only. Sound foreign policy and security policy cannot be done in 280 characters. Congress has offered the administration powerful leverage in this circumstance in the form of several pieces of legislation. First, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which passed this summer, and the Banking Restrictions Involving North Korea Act, which is pending before the Senate now. I support these tough, bipartisan sanction measures because I believe in turning the economic screws coupled with genuine diplomacy can yield results. In the new year, I urge the President to tone down the rhetoric and empower the Secretary of State and our senior diplomats to work with our partners in the region to find a diplomatic path towards a stable North Korea that doesn't threaten the United States or our allies. How about terrorist groups around the world? Over the last 16 years, the U.S. military, the intelligence community, and our Homeland Security professionals have worked hand in hand to meet the rise of terrorist groups head on. We owe the men and women in uniform a debt of gratitude for tirelessly leading the coalition fight that's rolled back ISIS's territorial gains. Implementing the new strategy, the administration's new strategy, and its call to fight terrorism at its source is not just about the military fight. The U.S. should also lead the international community in addressing the underlying issues that drive terrorist recruitment and help to rebuild communities newly liberated from terrorist control. Think about this. More than 65 million people around the world are displaced from their homes right now. 65 million people. So there is no purely military solution for this refugee crisis. A successful counterterrorism strategy requires us to work with our partners for information sharing and for contributions of development assistance. Another trouble spot in the world, Syria. In Syria, the connection between instability, displacement, and terrorism is clear. The conflict has been raging for nearly 7 years. In the absence of U.S. engagement on a political solution to this crisis, regional powers, namely Russia, Iran, and Turkey, have run the table to the benefit of the murderous Assad regime and at the expense of the Syrian people. The U.S. has abdicated its leadership role and ceded control of the outcomes to nations with interests often in direct conflict with our own. Recently, we learned that the administration will endorse a political transition plan that leaves Bashar al-Assad in power for at least another 4 years. This is unacceptable and dangerous. Assad is responsible for terrible war crimes, which led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Syrians and the displacement of millions more. The strategy outlined by the administration says, and I quote, "We will seek a settlement to the Syrian civil war that sets the conditions for refugees to return home and rebuild their lives in safety," unquote. I agree with that goal. Most people would agree with that goal, but the administration has missed the bigger picture. We need a strategy that pushes back on Russian and Iranian influences in Syria and addresses the underlying grievances that led to the conflict in the first place. Let me move to Iran. The Iranian regime remains a powerful force, for instability in the Middle East, especially through its support of terrorist proxies and militias. We know that the Iranians want to maintain control of territory linking Tehran with Beirut, so they will continue to act against U.S. interests in Iraq and Syria. Here again, Congress has offered powerful tools to the administration in the form of the Combating America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. The nuclear deal with Iran is giving us an unprecedented visibility on the Iranian nuclear program. Both the multilateral diplomatic channels built alongside that agreement have atrophied under this administration. Every time the president threatens to walk away from the Iran nuclear deal, he sends a clear signal to our allies and adversaries alike. U.S. commitments are written in disappearing ink. If the administration wants to get tough on Iran's non-nuclear bad behavior, there are concrete steps to take today. Number one, work with our allies to step up maritime interdictions of any illicit weapons traffic to or from Iran. Second, push the Europeans to do more to combat the financial networks that enrich the Iranian terrorist proxy, Hezbollah. My bipartisan Stop Terrorist Operations Resources and Money Act, so-called STORM Act, which is bipartisan, could help with that. And third, begin diplomatic conversations with our allies about a multilateral strategy to curtail the Iranian ballistic missile program. All of these efforts take cooperation with our allies, which the President makes harder every time he calls into question the future of the nuclear deal known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Finally, Russia and China. This new strategy by the administration repeatedly describes Russia and China as our competitors. Let me be clear, these countries are not our friends. They actively work against U.S. interests. They are threatened by American military dominance and economic power, and both are trying to game the system to undermine our advantages. China systematically, perniciously games the international trade system to its advantage. I firmly believe American workers in industry can out-innovate and outproduce any others in the world when the playing field is level. Driven by similar motives, Russia has meddled in elections across the Western world, trying to undermine confidence in one of our most fundamental institutions of democracy. Again, there are concrete steps the administration can take to counter these threats from both China and Russia. Number one, shore up our electoral systems and help others do the same. Number two, counter propaganda. Number three, fight corruption. Number four, get serious about holding trade cheaters like China accountable. Through engagement and cooperation, we can lead the rest of the world away from Cold War era clashes of power, the Cold War era clash of major powers that Russia and China want to create. Mr. President, just in conclusion, if this outline of some of the threats and challenges posed seems like a tremendous challenge, a great challenge for our nation, it's because it always has been so. It's always been a challenge. But as President Truman once said, quote, "America was not built on fear. America was built on courage, on imagination, and on unbeatable determination to do the job at hand," unquote. When faced with a challenge, whether it's Pennsylvanians or Americans, we don't shrink inward, we step up. Our adversaries want us to be divided and dispirited. These adversaries underestimate the courage, the imagination, and the determination of the American people. President Trump might see it differently, but as we close out 2017, I see a world that needs American leadership more than ever. To paraphrase President Kennedy, we should seek not a Pax Americana enforced on the world by American weapons of war, but a genuine peace that makes life on earth worth living. The American people are ready to rise to that challenge. I hope the administration is too.